Over tens of millions of years, the Earth has been cooling, but that may well not continue. Over the last 10,000 years, the Earth has warmed, and we're expecting another ice age in tens of thousands of years. And also, individual years are not particularly significant. The standard averaging period specified by the World Meteorological Organization is 30 years. Apparently, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. So climate is defined as the long-term average of weather. And also, talking of timescales, it's worth remembering oil is expected to last another 43 years only, gas 167 years, and coal 400 odd years. They won't literally run out, but become increasingly unobtainable. So we're interested in decades up to 2100. And if you look after the decades, the centuries should look after themselves. Human-induced climate change is a classic case of Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of Commons, published in 1968. The benefits of burning fossil fuels accrue to individuals, companies, and nations, while the costs accrue to the planet as a whole. The Tragedy of Commons is essentially a multiplayer generalization of the prisoner's dilemma. A common solution to certain resources is to convert the common good into private property. But unfortunately, we can't privatize the atmosphere. It keeps moving around. Yes, that's just the prisoner's dilemma. Probably the best known problem in game theory, been around since 1950. It's fundamental to climate change, where the cooperation involves limiting greenhouse gases, whilst defection involves emitting greenhouse gases. Free markets are a good thing. The surest way for a nation to increase its wealth is to implement a free market. However, externalities must be dealt with. An externality exists when economic transaction affects people that are not accounted for in the market price. Greenhouse gas emissions are an externality and can constitute the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. It's not like, say, congestion or local pollution, in several fundamental reasons. It's global, it's gradual, it's long-term, it's hard to reverse. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for over 100 years. Potentially of a huge scale. Global warming is a big problem. It involves major uncertainties. Although the science of global warming is relatively simple and well understood, we have little idea of what the future holds. For example, we don't know how the oceans are going to behave. So we do know it's a big problem, but we don't know how big. Governments should intervene and implement public policy to ensure that the costs of externalities are internalized in the marketplace. I implement the polluter pays principle. Although some governments, such as Iran, Russia, and China, actually do the polar opposite and subsidize fuel prices. But we also need to consider the past when we're considering a treaty, and this is essentially a moral judgment. Rich countries are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon put into the atmosphere since 1850, although it's developing countries that are hit earliest and hardest by climate change, such as Bangladesh. However, currently developing countries will be responsible for most of the growth of emissions in the future. And Africa, in a rare moment of unity, have requested cash reparations of $65 billion, although Africa has benefited hugely as an indirect consequence of the Industrial Revolution via aid, drugs, technology, etc. We tend to focus on the future, which is hugely uncertain, but we're already suffering the consequences of global warming today. I found a couple of studies, and it's estimated there are 150 to 300,000 additional deaths attributed to climate change every year now. Over 90% of the deaths attributable to climate change are related to the gradual environmental degradation it causes, principally malnutrition, diarrhea, and malaria. And climate change already costs the planet $125 billion every year. I considered the past and the present, but how should we discount the future? I've not really answered the question, but I've outlined a framework. The value of money in the future is determined by interest rates, but how do we determine the social discount rate? How much do you care about the future in 1, 10, 100, or 1,000 years' time? This is a moral judgment, and morality is a product of the gene-centered evolutionary forces which shape human social psychology. We've evolved on a need-to-know basis. That is, we are only required to be aware of our proximate motivations, such as sex and caring for kin, rather than our ultimate motivation, reproduction. So the point is, most people care only about their living relatives, not the future of mankind. Getting back to practicalities, what are the theoretical differences between a carbon tax and emissions trading? A carbon tax and emissions trading, like cap and trade, are theoretically equivalent, except that they're logically opposed regarding where the uncertainty lies. A carbon tax fixes the rate of taxation and allows emissions to vary. Emissions trading fixes emissions and allows the cost of compliance to vary. Intuitively, it is the emissions that we need to fix. So emissions trading would appear to be the obvious choice. However, the stability of a stable carbon tax would allow firms to invest in the long term, which is what we want. We need a correctly priced and stable carbon price. One solution is to tax and trade. If we generalize both of them, the regulator allocates an initial fixed quantity of permits, but may engage in trading of the permits, buying them back or selling more. The regulator is then free to vary both emissions and the cost of compliance. If the regulator does not engage in trading, he has to fix the emissions. If he sells an unlimited number of permits at a fixed price, he's fixed the cost of compliance. In other words, we have the best of both worlds. The regulator can choose to what extent both emissions and cost of compliance vary. That was just my idea. It's not necessarily a very good one. Where should the money go? If the government receives revenue as a consequence of the price of carbon, what should we do with that money? A carbon tax could be fiscally neutral by reducing other taxes through revenue recycling, or used for subsidies for renewables, such as grants or loans to develop electric cars or solar power. Another couple of ideas. The regulator could ensure that revenues from the scheme are used to finance a carbon sink endowment fund, from which payments are made to forest custodians to deter deforestation and encourage reforestation. That was the idea of Tim Joslin. And another approach would be to have a climate-friendly bloc of countries which impose a tariff on carbon imports that cross their mutual border and refund taxpayers within those countries, and the region could expand as other nations join. That's the idea of Stephen Stretton, a colleague of mine. Yes, limiting greenhouse gases has benefits beyond climate change mitigation, which is politically useful, which we call co-benefits. And they include improved air quality, improved water quality, improved health, such as fewer